Hello, everybody. So today I am going to do a flip through of poetry for the grammar stage and poetry for the grammar stage. So somebody requested that I was actually supposed to do this a couple weeks ago, and I totally forgot. So I'm doing it today. But what I'm going to do is I'm also going to save this to YouTube. I know I currently have a Memoria Press running highlight happening here on Instagram, but I like to keep that for more day in the life. Like, this is what that lesson looks like today that I'm doing, versus like a general an overview of flip through, because that will maybe take up the majority of my highlight space. So I like to keep that space separate, you know? So if you're interested in saving this content, like interested in seeing this and saving it for a later time, just remember you can catch it over there on YouTube. So I'm just going to save literally these exact same videos. I'm just going to group them together and just make them into a longer video. You have three different components to it. You have the anthology book, you have the student book, and you have the teacher's guide. To be honest, you kind of don't need the anthology book. The anthology book is kind of neat to have it as a separate thing because it's just all in one spot and it's all just right here. However, it is replicated in here and in your teacher's guide. So everybody would have a copy, you know? So let me just show you, and I'll show you the student guide, for instance. So you have the student guide here, and you'll notice the poem is here. So you have the poem here, and you have copy work that you can do if you want to. Sorry, my kids are making lunch in the background. And then you have vocabulary, and then you have all the parts in here in the student book to analyze that piece of poem, the poetry. So you have your analytical work, you're gonna do the rhyme scheme. Usually every single activity will have you do the rhyme scheme for the poetry. And then you have comprehension questions. And they're usually about this much. It's not an overwhelming. It's usually about this length, sometimes a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, but to be honest, it's about that length for the grammar stage one. And you'll see a difference when we get to the logic stage one. So let's do one more piece of poetry. So we have poetry over here. Again, it's replicated exactly how it would be in here. It would be in here. And then you have copy work. You would select parts of the poem and then you would replicate it over here on this side. And then you're always going to have vocabulary. Now, this is the part in here that may switch up a little bit in how they do it. You know, last time we saw that there were the replicated passages in here doing the rhyme scheme. On this one, it is think about the rhyming structure of this poem and write out the rhyme scheme. So it's a little bit different. You're still kind of doing the same thing. It's just a little bit different. And this remains constant throughout. You're always going to have comprehension questions. So let's do another one just so you can see. So again, the poem. And then you have some working space here. And then you have the exact same thing on this side. You're doing some copy work. And then you'll always have vocabulary. You notice that the vocabulary hasn't changed. Here, let me zoom in. Vocabulary. And then you see, again, you're always going to be working on the rhyming structure. Last time they had it different where you were replicating a part of the piece of the poem and then doing writing out the rhyme structure A, B, or whatever it is, right? This time it's replicated again for you in here and you just have to do A, B, or whatever the rhyme scheme structure is. And then remember, reading comprehension is always the same. And that's been pretty consistent throughout. Again, I'm 2/3 of the way through and it's pretty much the same. That's the same. It's very predictable and you know exactly what you're going to be doing and it doesn't change up on you too much. I will say, personal opinion on the poetry and stuff. There are so many beautiful pieces of poetry in here that I otherwise would never have been exposed to had I not gotten this. I've been so impressed with the quality of the poems, the poetry in here, and we've been exposed and introduced to so many, not even different poets, because we recognize a lot of the poets, but a lot of the poetry assigned for that given poet. Some of them are mainstream pieces of poetry that you've heard at one point, but I think they do a really good job of kind of diversifying it and providing variance in it where you're like, oh, I never heard that poem of his. You know what I mean? That kind of stuff. So that is the student guide and the anthology book. And then the teacher's guide is going to be the same, except that it's just going to have everything filled in. So hold on, let me get to a good part. So you'll see, let's take this piece of poetry, for instance. So you have the poem, again, replicated in the teacher's guide, and you have a blank space here to work with. Here's your copy work. So everything in the teacher's guide is exactly so far like the student guide. Everything so far has been pretty much the same, right? So where you're going to see the difference is when you get to the you have vocabulary, same thing. But when you get to the, again, rhyming structure part, this one is a little bit different from the others that I've shared with you, but it's all filled in. So the answers are filled in. The comprehension questions, all filled in. The stuff that's in this darker bold font, that's the answers filled in, you know? So let me just show you another one. So here's a piece of poetry in here. Remember, everything's the same from the teachers, from the student guide. You have your vocabulary, but see where it has analyze a rhyme structure? And we've seen this the way I showed it to you in the student guide, how you just have to fill in A, B, whatever the rhyme structure is, the rhyme scheme. There you go. And then it's just like filled in. And then the comprehension questions in here, just filled in. This one actually had quite a few comprehension questions. That's the most that I've seen so far. Okay, so that's grammar for the grammar stage. Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about poetry and short stories for the logic stage. So it's a little bit different. So for the grammar stage, you just had poetry for the grammar stage, right? Now you have poetry and short stories for the logic stage. And just like the other one, there's 3 components. You have the anthology book, you have the teacher's guide, and then you have the student guide. So I'll show you what the anthology book looks like first. So you have this, actually, let me see if there's a table of contents. Hold on a second. Yep. So here's a table of contents. Okay, and then this is what it looks like. So there's definitely a bump up. There's definitely a bump up from the grammar stage with the pieces of literature and poetry that they've selected. Versus, let me bring the other one back out again. Just to flip through it again. So there is a big step up. So you have, it looks like this, versus in here. Okay, so there's a difference in there in terms of intensity and reading level, as you would expect when you're going from the grammar stage to the logic stage, you know? So you have that. And then instead of showing you the teacher's guide first, we're going to go through the student guide first, because I think it's easier to visually see. That way, when I show you like the teacher's guide, it's essentially the same thing as a teacher's guide, as a student guide, except the answers are filled in, you know? So you have your table of contents, just like the anthology book. It has your how to use this guide, notes and instructions to the student, how to mark up a book, and then you have your introduction. So this one starts off with reading the introduction to American literature, and then you have reading comprehension questions to go along with it, all the way throughout the back. And now you're gonna start getting into the meat and the potatoes after you get through like the intro. So you have Washington Irving, Rip Van Winkle. I feel like that's a tongue twister. Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle. Say that fast 3 times. So anyway, what I like, and you'll notice like a little bit of a difference between that and the grammar stage, is that you have reading notes, and that wasn't included in the grammar stage. So you have reading notes, which is kind of just, it's providing you vocabulary, but it's kind of introducing you a little bit into the context of the situation, giving you a little bit more of an author or poet like background in here. So you have that. And then you get into what looks very similar to the grammar stage. I feel like there's a heavier emphasis here on vocabulary, whereas there was a big emphasis here in identifying rhyme structure. So if you guys remember in the beginning of in the logic stage, in the beginning of every single one, we had rhyme structure. And this would vary a little bit. Sometimes you had the poetry laid out. Remember where you did A, B, and that stuff. Sometimes you actually have to write it out, and sometimes it changes. But the overall activity is always rhyme structure, right? With the vocabulary up here. Well, it flips for the logic stage because they're assuming you already went and did at least a semester's worth, if not a whole year's worth of analyzing rhyme structure. So instead of using that space up in here, it looks like now we're just digging a little bit deeper into the vocabulary. So you have your definition bank over here, and then you have like vocabulary in here that you have to use, you know, so you're going to use the vocabulary, and then you also have comprehension questions. Now, this one's going to go more in depth, and it could be just because it's a short story, but this one's going to be treated a little bit differently from the poetry one. So we're going to do this short story one, and then I'll also show you like a poetry one. But you have your comprehension question, which is kind of giving you more into like the different parts of a story and some literature analysis. Whose point of view is being told in it, the exposition, the setting of the story, that type of stuff. List as many details as you can about the character. So some character analysis. You have a little bit of multiple choice questions in there. And then you're discussing the climax and the plot and describing the setting, Rip's state of mind and appearance when he wakes up, the village, 4 details about what he sees. Like you're really analyzing the short story in here. So you have that, but that's not it. Then you also are going into more of the Socratic questions. You have a whole slew of Socratic questions going into the central idea and details of the story, the conflict, symbolism, quote analysis, it looks like, identifying the main idea, the central idea. And then you have it over here again. In a few sentences, summarize Rip Van Winkle. And then provide 2 or 3 points to support your answer. And then copying a quote from the book. And then you have an essay option. So you're going to do a 2 to 5 paragraph essay regarding whatever the question prompt is. So that is one short story that you are doing. And then what I'm going to do, and then it goes into the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Oh, I didn't know that. Hold on. We got to go back in here. I wasn't paying too much attention to the table of contents. Oh, yeah, you're doing 2. You're doing Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow in there. Okay, let me find a piece of poetry. All right, so I just picked one that we would all be familiar with, right? Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening from Robert Frost, page 108. We're all going to be familiar with that. So that way we can really take a look and I can show you like how they do it with a piece of poetry, for instance, that we're all very familiar with, right? So Robert Frost, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, you have your reading notes. So you're kind of getting a little context into who Robert Frost was, what are harness spells and repetition and amplification being used for an emotional effect, So it's starting you off that way. Again, the definitions are going to play a huge part in this because instead of analyzing rhyme scheme or rhyme structure, they're using that space instead to really dive a little bit deeper into vocabulary and how it's being used in that piece of poetry. So then you have, sorry, I kind of skipped over here. You have comprehension questions and then you have Socratic questions. Oh, there wasn't that much vocabulary work. I was over here yapping away and I didn't even notice there wasn't hardly any vocabulary. Okay, my bad. All right, you have your Socratic questions in here. You're going to have a lot of, discussing figurative language conversations like alliteration and hyperbole and things like that. And it looks like shift in tone too, and then repetition. And then again, here's for your rhetoric expression. Again, what is your central idea? The details to support your response. Picking a quote from the book and copying it down over here, And then you have an essay option below where you're going to write a 2 to 5 paragraph essay. And then you have like your prompts down here on what you're supposed to do. Okay, let's do here, the road not taken. So here you'll see a little bit more vocabulary. Okay, and so you have your vocabulary, your definition bank, a little vocabulary work here, comprehension questions, your Socratic questions, same flow as the one before. And then again, your rhetoric expression. What is the central idea? Details to support your answer and an essay, 2 to 5 paragraph essay in here. And that looks like that's pretty much going to be the flow for all the pieces of poetry. So you see vocabulary, your definition bank, your comprehension questions, your Socratic questions, central idea, details to support that, and then your essay, 2 to 5 paragraph essay. And that is pretty much the flow on how the logic one is going to go for short stories and poetry. I'm just going to flip through the teacher's guide really quick just so you can see, but it's going to be exactly like the student guide, except the answers are going to be filled in. And I'm going to start off with the Rip Van Winkle. Start off with that one. So exactly the same, except you're going to see everything is filled in. Everything is filled in. The only parts that aren't going to be filled in, I mean, even in here, like it's all filled in. The only parts that's not going to be filled in are going to be the parts where they have to do like the essay. You know, there is not a template, like an example of what like an ideal essay would look like. That would be cool if they had included that, but they don't. But everything else, you know, and every now and then I'll have answers will vary, but for the most part, I've always found them to at least have some sort of like response in there for us to like go off of, you know. But yeah, this doesn't have any like a template, like an example essay, but that would be cool, right? But anyway, there you go, guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions. We've done the logic stage, poetry and short stories, and then the grammar stage version. You know, so we have the grammar stage, which is only poetry. And then when you get to the logic stage, they merge in a short story in there. So let me know if you have any questions. And again, I'm going to save this, compile it all together into one video and save it to YouTube. So if you want, you can just like save it there and look back on it whenever it's time for you guys to do these or to consider the curriculum. You can go back and you have it saved in one spot. Okay, guys, let me know if you have any questions.